Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of June 7th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Josh, are you rained out yet?
Man, I am so sick of this rain. Don't even get me. My wife is like going to lose it soon if we don't stop with the rain. It's too much.
Kid related, I suspect, to some degree.
It's more dog related than kid related.
Oh, yeah.
You send the kids out in the rain, whatever. The dogs, they don't clean their feet well. So,
yeah, right. That's a bad time to get that second dog, maybe, as it turns out, but who could have known? So today, Texas has been in the national media for the last couple weeks a bit as a result of, what the closing days of the legislative session looked like. And then more recently for the output of that legislative session, at least, and this is maybe one of the subtexts here, at least the output that was very visible to the national eye. And that legislative session ended on May 31st. So, we're just now getting out of the hot take phase, I think, particularly given the governor hasn't finished deciding or at least telling us what he's going to sign and what he's going to veto.
Or when exactly he's going to call them back. Yeah,
there's still some things pending out there. And we did very hot takes last week, which was sort of the morning after hot take. But the national media focus, some of which has also been pretty quick, does raise some interesting questions from the position of being on the ground here. So a couple of questions that have come up in the media, national media, really in the last couple of days. First, one of which is kind of right in our wheelhouse, is the question of whether the Texas legislature delivered to Texans, quote unquote, what they want or not. Mm-hmm. And I say it's in our wheelhouse, not because we have no special spiritual insight into what is going on in Texas, but because we do a lot of polling, of course. And then another related question is how the politics of the legislature's output fit into, if at all, a more national pattern. And we'll talk about those questions more generally, though each one in the last just couple of days has been focused by some national journalism. So, let's just start right away with the question of whether the Texas legislature delivered to Texans, quote unquote, what they want or not. One of many touchstones, and of course, this, many people have kind of written broadly about this. This issue has come up, or we hear a lot about it, I guess, because we do polling about what Texans want and decompose that. But Stacey Marie Ishmael had an op-ed in the Washington Post, I think published yesterday or maybe late Sunday night, but I think Monday. That was, telegraphed its overall intent with a title that was called "What's the Matter with Texas Legislators?" which is a takeoff on the "What's the Matter with Texas" line, which, is funny.
Well, it's funny, but I mean, as you said, in terms of forecasting, legislators is in parentheses. So it's what's the matter with Texas legislators. Right. And I mean, but I mean,
that's why it telegraphs so well, right?
Yeah, but I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, most of the national press comes at Texas from this kind of an angle. I mean, this has been going on for years, but this idea of, what is Texas up to?
Right. Well, and I think that's why putting the legislators on there is a nice, a nice nod to that and a suggestion that we're going to see, something a little different. So, the big question that comes up again and again in how we think about, Texas's profile and the policy environment, the political culture writ large here is, I think, to what degree does the output of the institutions, and that's why I think that legislators is important, do the rules, the institutions, the patterns of participation filter the inputs? I mean, so when I see what's the matter with Texas legislators, there's almost, you're invited to say, well, it's not necessarily something the matter with Texas, it's the legislators. Right? It's the legislature. And we, that there's a time honored, tradition in Texas going, pretty far back, but you have to go too far back. I mean, this was kind of the the Molly Ivins line. It's like, yes, Texas is a crazy place, but in part, it's crazy because the political class is crazy, right?
Yeah.
And that goes back, for those of you, Molly Ivins, I mean, this goes back to the 70s and 80s, right? So, and in early 90s of writing about Texas. So, how do we take that into account, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so what is the output that is really, what was the output that's getting all the attention? Well,
yeah, permitless carry, number one, probably. I think stricter abortion laws, probably number two. Increasingly, and this is a multi-session story, but an increasingly hostile state government orientation towards mostly city governments, in particular Texas's large cities, and in this case, particularly around police and policing.
But that even, and then the voting stuff, right?
And the voting, yeah, definitely the voting stuff, as we'll just call it broadly.
Right.
And I'll even kind of add into this, depends on which pieces you're reading. But I mean, there's also the stuff that Texas really hasn't kind of addressed, police brutality, gun violence,
right,
Medicaid expansion. And the thing we're not even talking about here, which is kind of, I would say funny, but more curious, is COVID, but which we're not talking about because wasn't really a central piece to the legislative, packages that made through.
Yeah, not something they did a lot about. I mean, one might say that about, well, I guess it wouldn't be fair to say that about the power outages because they spent a lot of time on it and there was legislative output on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it maybe broadly reflected public opinion. But, it does seem to me that one of the things that's interesting is how different the agenda felt at the end of the session as opposed to the run up to it in the very early days.
Yeah, I remember when we were talking before the session about, are they even going to really address that much? Partially because of the COVID protocols and restrictions, but also because, presumably the idea was we've just faced this huge pandemic, and this was before the winter storm happened. This idea was what are the important things they really need to address and get done? And we're like, are they going to have time for all this other stuff? And it turned out They had lots of time for lots of stuff.
Yeah,
and yet not enough.
Yeah, and ultimately, not a lot of substantive public health. Now, I mean, I think somebody would say some of the leadership would say, well, we did do a lot on public health. Most of it had to do with addressing who had the authority to participate in decision making, where the guardrails were for different institutions,
and where the guardrails were for liability.
It's and not things that were about public health in and of itself.
Right. Or the negative, like economic / health consequences of COVID that people are still experiencing.
Right. So, I mean, so when we look at this question of, and we should be fair to the point of the piece that we referenced, I mean, the thesis is ultimately that if you look at public opinion on a lot of these issues we just mentioned, on abortion, on Second Amendment / gun rights, to, put that in kind of quotation marks to some degree, in particular, and to a lesser degree, but also on the election measures, which I called the voting stuff. But what you mean was, there was a big bill, SB 7, that would have, ratcheted down, the voting process in a number of different ways.
I'd say curtailed the freedoms of counties to conduct elections.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, it was aimed to, to prevent counties from allowing things like extended voting hours, drive-through voting, a more, proactive approach to soliciting mail-in ballots. Now, that was the bill that got killed by the Democrats in the final, hours of the session, essentially. But it's also something that we know is going to be back, and something else that the legislature spent a lot of time and and there was a lot of profiling involved. That is a lot of legislatures talked about this a lot,
right, in
public, and it got a lot of coverage. And so the idea here, though, is that if you look at, the public opinion again particularly on abortion, guns, and some of the election measures, you don't find majority support for a lot of what we saw come out of the legislature, right? At least not a clear majority support.
Not among the entire voting population, no.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think there's a couple things here that kind of, I think this discussion is sort of crystallizing for me a little bit, which is, and this is always the case. I mean, I think we sort of face this in a very pragmatic and functional sense and trying to write polling to assess what happened in the legislative session. And I think what we were sort of struck by in, trying to write our, upcoming poll that would evaluate the session is just the volume of really, we call salient issues that the legislature touched on. And by salient, I mean, is just the sort of things that people probably have some sorts of opinions about. They may not have
Right.
strong opinions about the particular policies that were pursued, but to say that, Texans as a whole, voters as a whole don't have opinions about voting, about abortion, about, election conduct, guns. I mean, these are all things that have been in the public discussion for a long time.
Right.
And so the fact is they touched on a lot of those issues. And so, from our perspective, I mean, one of the hard things is, and I think it's always is like, when you try to go and say, well, what did the legislature, do this session? And you kind of go back and you say, like, in 2018 or 2019, you would have said, oh, property taxes and public ed. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't pass a similar number of bills to this session. They probably passed over, around 1,200 bills. A bunch of those got signed. They had to do with every walk of life, and usually in very minimal ways. But we usually define the session by, it was like this session.
Yeah.
It was the bathroom bill session, like would someone say 2015. This session kind of, I don't want to say it defies definition because it's been defined very clearly, but it's being defined as the most conservative, legislative session in a generation or ever, or whatever you want to call it. And that's made up of a range of different bills and things. And so when people say like, oh, did they do what Texans want? I mean, part of it is like, well, I mean, that's not really, I don't want to say that's not the point, but it just gets more complicated than that because there's sort of the specifics of what they did, which are usually very specific policy things that are either, minimal in nature or have a large cumulative impact, oftentimes. But there's that versus how these are going to be described and packaged to voters. And ultimately, if you take a step back from this idea of like, do people want or not want drive-through voting? Do people approve or disapprove of a 6-week abortion ban? But also do people, in our case, this is where things get complicated, but do they also want an outright ban on abortion? Well, it's a little bit tricky. You get into those kinds of spaces. Same thing with the gun issue. Do people think it's a good idea for people to be untrained walking around with handguns in public? Not really, but a majority of Republicans do. And this is where we start to get complicated about the who and the what. But I go even further to say that, when it comes down to delivering on what the voters want, it's not as though legislators and the governor and whomever are running are going to go back to their voters and say, let me give you a laundry list of policy proposals. What they're going to say is, we increased, we made Texas the premier pro-life state in the country. And generally that's going to be popular with a majority of Texas voters who continually sent Republicans who are pro-life back to office, both at the local and statewide level. The governor said that he wanted to make Texas a Second Amendment sanctuary state, whatever that means. And that's the point, whatever that means. And the legislature passed a bunch of bills that they could say presumably increased the state's place as, as a premier Second Amendment sanctuary state. Backing the blue. Again, that's, a general statement that probably polls very well when you talk about it that way. The specifics of those policies, ultimately, I don't want to say don't matter. They matter greatly to individuals, but in terms of the political space, not
right,
really.
Yeah, you need to, as a policy, they make a huge difference.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely very clear. As a policy, they make a huge difference. But in a political space, what you're basically saying, if I'm a Republican elected official right now and I'm listening to this national press, which again, and we've said this before, I'll just say real quick, New York Times writes a critical op-ed about, Texas or Texas Republicans. That's like a badge of honor. No problem. So all this attention in the Atlantic and the Washington Post, New York Times, all these places, it's not like Texas Republicans are sweating this. And the truth is, what they would say is, no, we get to go back to our voters and we increase border security funding. We increased gun rights. We made Texas, we protected the unborn and we backed the blue. What do you want from us?
Right. And so, it's important. You're making a distinction there between, basically how they communicate what they did and what they did. And it's not that they're night and day or they're completely different, but the policies themselves, land in a certain way with those who are very attentive to those policies.
I would say they land in I would say this, the policies land a certain way with people who are very attentive to those policies, but the way that those policies are going to be described going forward into primary seasons and beyond is such that even for those people who aren't attentive to the specific policies, they are supportive of the general principles.
No,
right?
That's the distinction I'm trying to clarify.
Okay. Right.
That, there's how the policy itself lands with the people that are attentive.
Right.
And have well-developed attitudes towards those policies. And then there's people who have a kind of general, less informed, less attentive, but still formed.
Right.
The difference between formed and informed attitude towards these things. It says, okay, if they're doing the pro-life thing, that's great. That's more or less what I want. Now,
That
I
gets
think
into the they a little bit.
Yeah, well, but then I think that's where the who is the they, and also like what, if people find out more about this policy, or the policies actually, actuate, or the policies are implemented in a particular way, you might actually get some friction. And I think that's where a little bit of this notion is this what people really wanted kind of came from.
I think that's very generous, but I agree with you.
You made a point in there that was kind of embedded in all that that's worth bringing out, which is that, to take the ban on abortion after 6 weeks, which is a law that was passed this session. But there's ambiguity in that. If we poll on that and say, do you support a ban on abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy? We do, in fact, find significant support for that.
Right.
Which is virtually,
I have the numbers right here.
Yeah.
It was 49 support, 41 opposed overall, but it was supported by 74% of Republicans, only opposed by 18%.
Right. And so part of the issue there, though, is that in a different abortion question, if we ask people, would you support an outright prohibition on abortion under any circumstances?
Yeah, majority would say no. And then if we ask,
support is less than 20%, as I recall.
And that's if we talk about a prohibition. And then if we talk about whether basically, there's a bunch of ways you can ask these questions, just to be clear. But if you basically say, if you give people an abortion question with an option of basically abortion should never be permitted, it's about 10 to 12% of all Texans, about 19% of Republicans, so 1 in 5. And that's where the ambiguity lies. But I think a lot of people are looking at that and saying, you see that? They did something that people don't want. And I say, well, you gotta slow down a second here. Got to cool your jets, right? Because ultimately, that it's in that friction that actually, I think
a lot of politics takes place.
A lot of politics takes place. And ultimately, for Republicans who've controlled the state for, 20 years and have been passing conservative legislation for 20 years, ultimately, we're kind of at a point in the, the lifespan of the Republican Party here and of the conservative dominance here where, you're going to have to be pushing the outer bounds of a lot of policy areas. There's not a lot of areas of policy in Texas where conservative principles and priorities have not, dominated the discussion for a while and have not acted. So ultimately, it's not like Texas Republicans are going to come in 2021 into the legislative session and say, boy, nobody's done anything here to, limit abortion. No, they've been limiting abortion for decades. So ultimately, you kind of get to this point. But the issue is that, we always talk about sort of, kind of passive support. And ultimately, most Republicans are going to identify as pro-life. Republicans are the majority of party. There's generally, we found in polling pretty, open acceptance of limiting abortion around the edges. But then we get into this area where this is the definitional piece, where Republicans simply, doing what they needed to do to further kind of limit abortion, or were they taking a step too far and outright banning it? It's always been the supposition that once they go and like ban abortion, there's going to be a backlash. But I think, and take another step back, we haven't seen much of a backlash over anything here.
Well, and this is going to be this is a question moving forward. And again, on this particular issue, or this particular policy and that particular legislation on the 6-week ban, that's a 6-week plus ban because of the dynamics in which a lot of women aren't going to know they're pregnant by the time they find out. It's going to be a de facto ban, for a lot of people, or it's going to get much closer to that. So the question, will be, what is the feedback on, what does the feedback loop look like that? Or that's one question about that.
But I think the point that, here is that the feedback loop, and this will kind of get to one of the other points here is, the feedback loop from issue voters, from Republican primary voters who are very attuned to abortion policy is going to be extremely positive. If you're someone who votes solely based on Second Amendment rights, the feedback, even though again there's ambiguity there too, right? Well, the feedback is going to be pretty positive, and those groups are overrepresented.
Well, and it also raises a point that I raised at the outset here that I wanted to get to, which is the forum for that. What we're kind of in a very dry way calling feedback. The forum for getting that feedback and when the legislators are going to feel that the most and when they're most worried about that. Mm-hmm. For most of these Republican incumbents is going to be the primary election because they're not anticipating a lot of competition. So it does lead to what, from the consideration of the universe of Texas voters, could be seen as oversteer, but it depends on where the focus is, right?
Yeah,
I think so.
This oversteer argument to me is interesting. I mean, I kind of keep coming back to this notion of, the Democrats came out and
Well, I said the appearance of oversteer. I mean,
yeah, no, I'm not saying that you're saying this. I'm just talking about this general argument about the oversteer. And I mean, part of it is, you can look at this two ways, which is, it's an oversteer if you believe that the state is trending Democratic, and there's reasons to think that, right? And I don't mean that it's Democratic, but in the sense that
it's
the
becoming
margins
more
have got it.
competitive.
It's becoming more competitive. And I think, from the outside looking in, a lot of people say, well, look at the demographics of Texas and look at where people are living in these cities. The urban centers are becoming bigger and bigger and growing faster, and they're more diverse, et cetera, et cetera. And I would just, say, yeah, but for all the crowing that Democrats have done, they didn't advance at all in the 2020 election. And also, Texas is a place where 60% of the voting eligible population voted in the 2020 election. So the 40% of, the 40% of the potential electorate, and a lot of the people that I think people outside the state think of as potentially, revolting against some of this, don't vote here. And Democrats haven't really, presented any evidence that they are good at or have any plan for turning these people out. So if I'm a Republican and I'm sitting here saying we just keep winning, and also I think, this is kind of something we should talk about too, but looking at the national level where everything is just gridlocked into nothingness, I think it's odd not to expect the state to, especially the Republican state, to deliver to their voters because they don't have an excuse not to.
Well, yeah, I think expectations are high particularly among mobilized Republicans. And again, I still think there's a little bit of an institutional piece there that whose expectations, right? And so that's a piece of this as well.
Yeah, the institutional stuff reinforces it, though, right? In the sense that we also have a more conservative lieutenant governor than we had previously in terms of David Dewhurst and Dan Patrick. We have more conservative speakers now than we had from the Strauss era. So what do you expect?
So let's, you mentioned, the sort of, let's look at it again now from sort of the outside in. This has been almost painfully inside out. Let's go to that from the outside in. A second piece this week was Ron Brownstein's piece in The Atlantic. It's called "Watch What's Happening in Red States." The subtitle, the bullet is kind of, in states where Republicans control the legislature, American life is rapidly changing. Now, he covers a lot of the territory and looks at not just Texas, but several similarly Republican states that have had, similar experiences in a lot of ways in terms of pushing legislation like the legislation we're talking about and in some other policy areas as well. But it's interesting because, he winds up in a very different place. Now, part of this is just focus, is that he's thinking about, a national terrain and trying to be comparative here. But he also, he ends the piece with something like a description of people's expectations that somehow, once Trump was defeated and Donald Trump is no longer president, that these sort of conservative fires would burn less hot. I'm not sure if that's a straw man or not, but it's an interestingly different way of looking at what happened and thinking about what the causality is and where it's coming from. Right. And I like the two pieces together because I think, I think they're both onto something in their own way. Right. About what the dynamics are internally and what the dynamics are externally. And it's an interesting way of thinking about how national and state level politics kind of interact to read them in conjunction. Right.
Yeah, it's funny. There's sort of two reactions I have to that. One is there's sort of a waiting for Godot aspect to the whole, well, when are the moderate Republicans or the, principled conservatives going to come in and say, hey, wait a second, this isn't the party? And the truth, and the thing is, we experienced a little bit of this with the Tea Party rise and fall. We would go and we'd ask the people in polling from kind of 2010 on, whether we asked a question basically to identify Tea Party adherents or not. It doesn't matter how we did it. But so we would do this, and then you'd kind of go and we'd ask about the Tea Party influence. We'd say, does the Tea Party have too much, too little, about the right amount of influence? And the most interesting thing out of that pair of questions that we asked repeatedly, I think, was that, the majority of Republicans who we didn't identify as Tea Party Republicans. So we just say they're moderates, they're just non-Tea Party, whatever, but they're probably less, extremely conservative, if nothing else. When we asked that influence question, they'd always say that the Tea Party was either, had the right amount of influence or not enough. Right. It wasn't though there was, that was where the center of gravity was. And we described this often as sort of passive support. And so I think it's important for people to remember that, even, these sort of, let's go quote unquote moderate Republicans who don't necessarily fit the Trump mold, they probably agree with Trump Republicans on a lot more stuff than they don't. And that's kind of important to remember here. It's
Yeah.
not like there's clearly not some block. But the other thing I'd say is, the lesson maybe from 2020 and 2018, the combined lessons, is that I'm not sure that Republicans are, one, scared of turnout as much as they used to be. I mean,
Yeah.
that's, again, a complicated discussion in the current environment, but ultimately, higher turnout in Texas did not hurt them. And number two, I think the other piece of this is, looking at sort of how the difficulties they had in 2018 that they didn't face in 2020, at least they maintained the status quo, is you're seeing Republicans in both Texas and other states trying to mobilize that Trump coalition for the next round. And ultimately, part of, I think, the Trump, approach is ultimately the ends always justify the means, and you take what you can get. And I think you're seeing a lot more of that, and you're seeing, that sort of style of governance. And I think that's a calculated risk that I think Republicans are willing to take, especially going into redistricting.
Well, and I think especially in Texas where, as we noted before, the underlying politics that I think from the outside people think of as Trumpism or the Trump unleashed the Trump unleashed forces, we're always kind of there.
Yeah.
He was the entrepreneur of marshaling these forces. But he's also, in the end, the Trump experience had the kind of impact I think you're talking about in terms of both governance style and, the aggravation of, the forces of negative partisanship, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is the idea that what really part of what defines you is not just and this is an interesting reflection, I think, on the fact that we think people are focusing on policy output, that what they're really fundamentally interested in a lot of ways is identifying themselves vis-a-vis what they're not, that is, or their negative view of what their opponents are. And I think that's one of the things that we saw really make manifest in this session that's been lurking in Texas and has been around, but is the idea that almost anything that you could identify as a Democratic policy preference this time became something that was attacked with great rigor. And that drove a lot of the policy output. And it also drove the process in a way that I think a lot of people noticed. We've talked about this, I think maybe on here or not. But so there is an element in which, negative party identification, that is the idea that parties are so, identified by their negative impressions of the other party. That's one of the things that Trump tapped into without any guardrails at all. And I think you saw that happening at various points internally during this legislative session where we talk a lot about the different divisions, like socially and factionally inside the Texas legislature. One of the ones that was interesting that I think became more apparent this time was between those who felt like there was still a kind of ethic of cooperation and a functionality to cooperation between members of different parties, and those who just felt like that was an inconvenience and were not interested in that. And it was pretty apparent at different times on these most divisive bills that we've been talking about. It was very apparent during the abortion discussions on the floor, particularly in the House, but also in the Senate. And it was very apparent in the gun discussions. It was very apparent in the election discussions that there was almost like a sense from some of the sponsors of some of that legislation and some of the chairmen who are very much of a relatively newer generation of legislators, they're mostly more recently elected, that they really weren't interested in what they almost seemed to take as the ritual of listening to the opposing arguments. It was very much a kind of, you hear somebody be at the back mic speaking, and you sit at the back mic and to ask questions of the person at the front mic. A sense of kind of Are you done yet?
Yeah.
And I think if there was any moment that made me feel like there is something about that, those were the moments when I felt like this notion of the mood of what we might think of as the Trump impact was really evident. Now, might that have happened without Trump? Probably. It's happened in the past. There are people that have always been like that, but it seemed much more prevalent this time. And that is kind of driving, and it is not just that. It's also the duration of the time that one party has been basically dominating the agenda and the process. There's nobody.
It's also the volume of the I would say difficult legislation that they had to deal with also.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a contributor, but I think there's definitely a sense that I'd have to go and look at it a little bit more, because there's certainly some people that have been there for a long time have probably, adjusted and adopted this attitude. But I do think there's a certain kind of institutional socialization to the norms of the institution that are being, again, reinforced by these powerful outside forces.
Yeah. And, and I would add to that, I think, and I know you're not, I think you're partially describing the Republican majority, but I think, you could also make that description a little bit in terms of the newer generation, older generation, but you could also see that on the Democratic side in terms of the approach of Democratic members at the back mic in terms of, the whole like, hey, I just want to make your bill better. I know I don't like this bill, but this might help make it less bad, kind of in the older generation, to the sort of, so like, are you aware that you're a racist, or that this is racist, kind of some of the newer generation of Democratic leaders. But this is also taking place nationally too. I mean, I think one of the interesting things in all of this, going back to kind of the national perspective, is there's this sort of focus on, again, these Republican states and the extent at which they're lurching further to the right on the one hand, but ultimately, California is doing its own thing too. Right. I mean, there is, and this is sort of, again, to the extent that the national, the federal government is incapable of moving anything because of a lot of reasons, ultimately it is coming to state legislatures to deliver on policy goals for their voters. The interesting thing to me going forward that I'm still trying to like untangle here is, does this work in a place like Texas and a place like Florida? I mean, those are sort of the two kind of that I would put together in the sense of, these very large, very diverse, and I would say in the case of Texas, more so than Florida, pretty much urban states. There's a tension here that, we're kind of, that is being papered over, that's sort of curious and interesting in the sense that, most states with large urban centers have Democratic control, and they're, going in a completely different direction. And the question is, how long can, the Republican state, one, kind of be hostile to cities on the one hand, but two, there's I've said this before, but there's an opportunity here, I think, both in Florida and Texas to say, this is what Republican governance looks like in a largely urban, very diverse, very young state.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's anything about this session that makes you think, well, they did it this time.
Yeah. I think that it will be interesting to see how that discussion moves forward. And I think there's a tension between the position on economic development and the view of the cities that is still pretty unresolved. There are probably opportunities there. There are opportunities for both parties, I think, if they can unpack that. So, all right. So I think as to close this out, I'll be interested to see how this discussion moves forward in terms of everybody's view of what this is going to mean and what the connections are going to be between what we saw going on inside the state, the forces outside the state, and how they interact. So,
yeah. And the thing I'm most forward to learning more about here is what the voters actually got out of this session. We follow this thing closely. We get up every day and we're reading clips and we're, following Twitter, we're watching the stream, and, we have kind of our impressions of this thing. But what I'm really curious about is how much, given the volume, especially, how much of this got through to people? Did they find out something about what the legislature did in area A, B, or C? And did they have an evaluation of it? I'm really curious to see, because that's really, ultimately all this speculation from us, from other people, it's kind of moot until we know actually what the voters picked up from what happened.
I think, the key question is, what got through to who?
Yep.
And with how much intensity. So, okay, with that, this has been the Second Reading podcast for the week of June 7th. I want to thank Josh for being here. Thank our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas. And we will be back next week. Thanks for listening. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.